So you're going to find most of the metrics within a given test are going to be tightly correlated together, and they're going to be more similar to other metrics from that test than they will be to another test. So it's a matter of understanding the type of strength quality that you've deemed to be most important. You only have so much time and effort and resources available to put forward information and data. So you've got to be sensible with how you use it.
Lachlan James, welcome to VALDCast.
Pleasure to be here.
Oh man, I'm selfishly very excited for this episode. Just we've had some interactions in the past and back and forth on some projects, and it's exciting to not only have a podcast but be able to chat face to face. So this will be super fun.
Yeah, awesome. Looking forward to it.
All right, so Lachlan, maybe for individuals who may recognize the name a little bit but aren't super familiar with who you are and what you do, maybe just give us a brief background on what brought you here today.
Sure. So I'm Associate Professor of Sports Science at Trobe University, and I have a small consultancy company called ForceLab, which looks at strength science solutions for people in industry, clubs, and the like. But my background originally was in strength and conditioning. I did that for 10 years and made the pivot to research, applied research, when I did my PhD, and then kind of made the transition into academia. And most of my research involves high performance athletes or professional athletes with research questions embedded with clubs. And then I've kind of evolved to really understanding the strength science side of things and making that information digestible and applicable to those in practice.
I like that. And it's cool. The term strength science, I think, is this new and evolving term. I mean, obviously there's strength and conditioning, there's sports science, there's physiotherapy, there's all these different disciplines. When you think about strength science, just as a follow-up, like what does that term mean to you, and what do you mean when you study strength science?
Yeah, so I think we're talking about the different aspects of maximal force expression, right? So it ranges from what we traditionally call power all the way up to maximal strength and everything in between. It could involve like the assessment and diagnosis of particular strength qualities or specific strength qualities in addition to targeted training for those qualities. And a big part of it is understanding or diagnosing which forms of force expression or which pieces of maximal or explosive or dynamic or reactive strength are most important within a given context or a given environment. We're in a really good position these days where we can measure a lot of things, but with that comes challenges. And those challenges arise by way of understanding what measures matters the most in what context.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's you guys have done some really cool work, and this idea of measurement redundancy, I think, is always top of mind for some folks. For the same reason that you said, you take a counter movement jump on Forcex, for example, and you get over 200 metrics just from a single jump. So for individuals trying to tease apart, okay, what do all these things mean? You guys have done some really cool work in terms of trying to decipher, okay, what measures explain certain qualities, what don't. Do you want to just kind of give a brief background on, the type of research that you guys have done to determine these sorts of things and maybe what that means moving forward?
Yeah, so if you kind of look through the literature, you'll see, lots of different terms used to describe, say, lower body force expression, power, explosiveness, rate of force development, maximal, isometric, dynamic, just like dozens of different terms. They've been used interchangeably, right? And then with that, there's been a range of different measures that are being used as well. So what we've tried to do is look at, okay, if we look at all of the different strength power measures that exist across lower body, bilateral, extension type actions, what unique pieces of information exist and what's redundant. So when you reduce all of those hundreds of different metrics across dozens of different tests down, statistically, what it reveals is there's roughly 5 distinct strength qualities or independent domains. And all of the metrics will fall into one of those 5 dimensions. So within each domain or dimension, you might have a dozen or 2 dozen metrics that all kind of tell you the same thing. And then each of those dimensions will be very different from each other. They represent a specific and unique strength quality. And by going through that process, we've found that we've got roughly 5, and it can vary depending on the context, but we've got maximal isometric strength, which is the peak force achieved during an isometric mid-thigh pull or an isometric squat. We've got explosive strength, which is the early part of the isometric force time curve, about 150 milliseconds or earlier. After that, we've got what we used to call maximal power, but we might call fast dynamic strength now, and they're measures derived from, say, a counter movement jump or a squat jump. We've got our classic traditional heavy dynamic strength. So that's your lifting strength, 1, 3, 5 RM, squat, deadlift, power clean. So moving heavy loads through range. And finally, we've got reactive strength, which is your ability to perform in a fast stretch shortening cycle action with times of less than 250 milliseconds or so. So generally speaking, they're the 5 different dimensions of strength that exist. And we can start to use that to help inform our strength diagnosis or help better apply our testing and measurement procedures in practice.
Lachlan, when we're thinking about these sorts of, interrelated or separate, I should actually say, domains, how do we best understand which domains have greater value and which domains maybe we don't necessarily need to focus on just yet?
Sure. So after we've built our performance model and we've rank ordered and established the importance of each of the different strength qualities, so from number 1 all the way down to number 5, so from top priority all the way down to tertiary priority, then we can start to zoom in. And we might zoom in really closely on those areas that we deem most important. So on those strength qualities that we feel matter the most, we might capture more metrics to get a greater resolution and a greater degree of granularity on what's occurring during that test or during that action. So that's a time when we can zoom in. And then we can zoom out a little bit as we start to move down the priority list. So those measures or domains that we deem to be less important, relatively speaking, then that might be where we only choose a couple of metrics from those domains, because the greater resolution isn't worth the cost of attention it takes from the end user. So we only have so much attention that we as humans can put towards something or information that we're capable of processing at any one time. So the end user, whether that's a sports scientist or the coach or the high performance manager or the athlete, they can't process 15 different pieces of information all at once. Maybe you can process 5 to 10 pieces of information at once, but there'll be times to zoom in. And so you want to use that attention wisely. And you use it wisely by zooming in on those qualities you deem most important and zooming out a little bit on those that maybe fall down the priority hierarchy.
Lachlan, a follow-up here. I think a lot of practitioners may be listening and saying, I'm kind of following along and I'm starting to get this, but it's hard to really truly grasp this without maybe a tangible example. Can you give an example of maybe somebody has access to ForceLab in their clinic, and they want to focus on, maybe it's some type of a jump assessment, whether it's reactivity, whether it's dynamic, strength or power. How would one go about that process of zooming in and or zooming out when they have an individual in front of them that they're actively training or rehabilitating?
Yeah, great question. So probably a good example would be, let's say, a triple jumper or a long jumper or a high jumper, right? If you just went by the basic model of the 5 domains, you'd just choose 1 or 2 measures from each of those 5 domains and you'd rank them all equally and then you go forward from there. But you'd be missing information and you wouldn't be prioritizing. So if you go through building your performance model and you've got your triple jumper, high jumper, long jumper, you might find that you've got reactive strength at the top. That's at the top of your pyramid. That's number 1. And maybe it's fast strength. So it might be a slow stretch shortening cycle action, and explosive strength might be sort of secondary, maybe tertiary, maybe it's heavy dynamic strength or maximal isometric strength. So what that means is, rather than choosing just a single measure of reactive strength, so rather than doing drop jump off a 30 centimeter height and just getting RSI, you might do incremental heights. So that might be worth the time and effort to go through incremental heights, get multiple measures of the reactive strength index, as well as you looking at the constituent parts of it. So the jump height derived from flight time and the contact time, in addition to maybe measures of stiffness or a spring-like correlation, right? So you're going to zoom in deep on reactive strength. And so you might get 5, 6, 7 measures there perhaps, right? And then you take your level down. All right, so we've determined that fast strength, so a slow stretch shortening cycle action like a counter movement jump is important. Maybe you get 1 or 2 measures from that. Maybe it's a jump height and it's a time to take off. And maybe you find that explosive strength is also kind of in that area. So maybe we're going to get 1 measure of early force from an ISO squat. I'm going to take that 150 milliseconds or so from initiation. All right, there. And finally, our tertiary measures might be something like isometric peak force and heavy dynamic strength. So you might just get 1 measure of each of those, and you might not do them that frequently. So they might just be done at the end of every mesocycle or so. So you're just getting 1 or 2 measures there, and that one strength quality that you've revealed to be most important, you dial in that and you put the attention there.
One thing that I love that you're kind of providing with these examples is so often I think individuals that are starting out with force plate assessment or just integrating technology as a whole, they'll look at something and they'll say, okay, we're gonna do jump tests and we're gonna do a reactive strength index. So we're going to look at these metrics because these are the metrics for this idea. But in reality, instead of saying, okay, well, what metrics am I looking at? You guys are taking a step back and using this model to say, wait a second, what actions are actually the things that are driving the specific quality that we want to assess? So let's start with the test first, rather than saying, oh, well, we need to look at this metric or we need to look at this metric. You're saying, well, we want to look at maximum isometric strength or something similar. So you implement a obviously maximum isometric assessment. However, what's not happening is somebody saying, well, I want to look at the reactive strength index, right, as a measure. Because what you could do is you could go through and do a hop test or a drop dump or something similar, and you could instead look at the coefficient of restitution, or you could look at some other metric, right, that isn't just the reactive strength index, that for whatever reason, that may be the variable that better explains the underlying characteristic that you're trying to uncover. And so I think it's a really smart way to approach it. Instead of glomming so specific onto a metric, you're zooming out just a little bit to say, this is a test that measures a specific quality. Any metrics within this test are inherently going to explain some variable within that quality, which I find very interesting.
Yeah, that's right. You hit the nail on the head, right? So, the test is a measure to capture a particular quality, and the outputs are going to be constrained by the constraints of the test. The time available to express force, and then the loading against which force is expressed, right? So you're going to find most metrics within a given test are going to be tightly correlated together, and they're going to be more similar to other metrics from that test than they will be to another test, right? So the tests generally capture different things. So it's a matter of understanding the type of strength quality that you've deemed to be most important or less important. And then from there, knowing when to zoom in or when to zoom out. And if you decide that this is an important quality, then you can zoom in and you can take more measures that help explain that expression of force. And for those that are less relevant, you can just get one or two that capture the majority of the variance. You don't need to capture 100% of it because it's only a tertiary quality. You only have so much time and effort and resources available to put forward information and data. So you've got to be sensible with how you use it.
I find that so interesting because a lot of times within research or within just performance as a whole, you can go through these ideas of, oh, sure, yeah, like this is what we do because we've always done it this way. And there can be layers and layers of just assumptions that people make over time. And we get to a certain area and say, well, yeah, of course I'm going to do, for example, squats for lower body power. You're like, okay, well, why? Is power something that is inherently beneficial within this area? Is this something that we can actually truly measure? Or is this something that is a proxy for something else? And I think although it may seem simple or intuitive to some people, like, well, yeah, of course you have like heavy, slow strength, you have power, you have, maximal efforts, you have, short efforts. It's so important to be able to categorize these sorts of things because then now you have 5 key buckets that you now need to train, or you can at least monitor and manage so that those buckets either improve or maintain. Because I think it's one of those things that is, people will just kind of continuously say, well, we got to get stronger. It's like, well, what form of strength, and how strong is strong enough? And by archetyping these sorts of buckets in knee, it makes the job of the practitioner so much easier, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important to recognize it's the first step of many in developing a performance model. It's a very important step, which is establishing what unique piece of information exists. And if you just start there and if you happen to stop there, it's probably better than what's occurring in 80% of locations anyway, right, or environments. But you need to take it further because not all strength quality is going to be equally important all at once, all in the same context. They're not. It's going to be context dependent, of course, right? And this is simply a process of needs analysis, which seems to have been forgotten in many ways. So it's important to build a performance model to help inform you rank and prioritize those strength power qualities that are most relevant in your context.
Yeah, definitely. Lachlan, after talking about this, I'm realizing I may not be the best podcast host because we haven't gotten to any of the questions that we even started out with. But kind of zooming in on that, we kind of helped you out a little bit in terms of just kind of designing part of this paper that you wrote. Or we didn't have anything to do with the paper, let's be clear, but just kind of helping put it in a digestible format. Do you want to just kind of break through what that model looks like and just to be able to explain to the listeners, what the importance of it is and how we can kind of apply that model within practice?
Yeah. So I collaborated with Vold on visualizing the performance model that I put out there via a publication a year or two ago. And that visualization has been really helpful in communicating that to those in the field. And I'll explain how the model works now. It's a fairly logical stepwise process. Ultimately, you want to connect the measurement to the outcome of interest, right? And that's a bit easier in deterministic or measured sports like track and field or swimming or rowing, but the vast majority of sports we deal with are complex dynamic systems, right? Like team sports and combat sports, where you can't simply just measure the outcome and establish a cause and effect. So what you need to do is you need to build in a series of intermediary steps between the measurement and the outcome of interest in order to create what we call layers of validity to help inform your decision-making as to whether or not you think a measure is worthwhile to include or not. So if we start at the very top, the very end, sports performance, we need some way to quantify that. And that can be done a range of ways. It might be wins or losses, it could be points scored, it could be higher versus lower tier players. It could even be the game model or the coach's influence on that. The coach might say, this is our game model and therefore these are important features of our gameplay that we're looking for. But it's hard to connect, or you never will feasibly connect a measure, a performance measure in the gym or on the pitch during training to the outcome measure like that. So you need like an intermediary step, and that can be through your key performance indicators. So these are action variables that are often derived from actual gameplay. And it could be taken from GPS measures or it could be taken from notational analysis. And those key performance indicators will have a tight correlation to the outcome of interest, to wins or losses, or to points scored, or to the coach's game model. So you could empirically measure that. So as this KPI goes up, that's an indicator that we're meeting the coach's game model, or an increased likelihood of winning, or an increased likelihood of scoring points, for example. And then you can move back from that and you can start to link the physical qualities, so let's say in our case, the strength domains, to that KPI, right? We can start to look at the empirical links or the coefficients between those strength power variables and those KPIs. And so that's a way of doing it. And so you can start to see, okay, if as strength level, let's say maximal heavy dynamic strength, so your 1RM, as your 1RM increases, do those with a higher 1RM perform better in this KPI? Do they perform worse? Or is it unclear whether they perform better or worse? And what's the confidence of that relationship, right? And you just do that. You can do that for all of the potential candidate measures that you're looking at. And based on the evidence that you find and the strength of those coefficients to the KPIs, you can then start to rank order and prioritize the strength qualities or any physical performance measure. If you're perhaps sprint qualities or endurance qualities, rank order those based on how strong they associate to the KPIs. And that gives you a means by which of prioritizing the measures that are most important in your context.
It's cool. You started the answer to that question with the term logical. And I think that's so important because at the end of the day, right, it's what we're doing here is not anything crazy, right? It's not anything where it's like, oh, well, we see this metric changes and that leads to a championship. It's like, no, you follow a logical progression of, well, if we understand that there's an underpinning quality that a metric monitors that then influences some type of performance attribute, well, if we can link that performance attribute to some type of KPI, like you're referencing, or to a sporting outcome, i.e. speed, if we're using, a deterministic sport like track and field, then, it all starts to kind of make sense and it seems intuitive or logical to follow. I guess I'd be curious what kind of work you've done or if you've explored ideas behind this idea. We released a advanced force plate guide recently. And within that guide, there was this idea of discriminatory metrics or metrics that, maybe you take individuals that are high performers in a higher level league. You call it, for example, if we're using basketball, the NBA. And then there's a metric that only that NBA players can perform higher on than somebody like a G League or the next level down. Is there a way in which these types of discriminatory metrics, one of which would be concentric impulse between 0 and 100 milliseconds, do these metrics play a role at all within this framework, or is this something totally different?
No, but same thing. So the high versus lower tier players, and however you choose to categorize that, whether it's NBA versus G League, whether it's pro versus amateur, whether it's UFC rostered fighters versus academy fighters, that's a way of establishing what's called construct validity, right? And those measures that best distinguish the two groups are those which you can consider for prioritization. That's one of a few different approaches, but that definitely falls within the framework, right? It's called construct validity. So you can absolutely do that. And you think of validity as an accumulation of evidence towards a validity proposition. So you would look at that, and that is one piece of evidence that is strong and works in the favor of that particular measure. So that's great. That's good. That's from what other evidence do we have for or against that? And you build it up over time. You're like, all right, when we look at everything together, this is important here. Oh, and other things also indicate that it's important too. For that reason, we might put that as number one. Right? But absolutely, it's a really simple way that practitioners can do it in their own environment too. So if you've got two different standards of competition that you're responsible for, you can compare the performance from the higher standard players, so the higher league players versus lower league players, which measures distinguish those two groups the best. Because chances are you might have quite a few, right? But they won't all distinguish the two groups equally as much. Mm-hmm. So some will have greater distinguishing capability than others, and then you can rank order them, which does it the most and which does it the least. And then that's a really powerful yet simple way of going about establishing a piece of evidence towards the validity of that metric to the performance outcome.
So a lot of this conversation is somewhat, on the higher level of sports application. Yes, there's underpinning principles and ideas that span from beginner to advanced. However, a question that I love asking individuals such as yourself is this idea of what are the basics that are associated, or what are the common things that kind of everybody should know when it comes to sports science or sports measurement. The analogy that I always give is kind of public health, right? By and large, most people know you either walk a little bit more, you increase your physical activity, you become more conscious of your eating habits, and most of the time you can live a healthier life. The basics are quite simple. However, that is very specific within a public health domain. What are the corollaries to that when we think about sports science or strength diagnostics, in your opinion?
Yeah, sure. We can think of it maybe through three separate lenses, right? We can go, okay, how is this measure going to inform the training process? Can I use this measure to inform the training process? So yes or no. And part of that, how can I use it to inform the training process, is, does it have corollaries or strong links to the next stage in your model, right? Does it have strong links to some sort of a KPI, or does it really strongly differentiate high from lower tier players? And that might be based on your own data if you're lucky enough to have it, or you can turn to the literature for that too. So that's kind of your first one. And of course, can you capture it in a valid and reliable way? They're your measurement properties. The next one, you like to think of it as organizational factors as well, and feasibility factors. Like, can you afford it? Can you afford the time it takes to implement it? Is it telling you something you didn't already know? Okay, what's the time cost of implementing it? What's the time cost of upskilling the testers to perform it? The time cost of analyzing the data, and the time cost of familiarizing the performer in order to do it. Now, fortunately, with VALD systems, a lot of that time cost has been reduced because of the smooth efficiency of analysis and implementation as well. But they're important questions to ask alongside the measurement properties questions. So I think if you can ask those and you can see, okay, this provides strong evidence that I should consider this measure in my training environment, then that's probably the good way to start.
That's great. Lachlan, I really appreciate this conversation. I think it's something that I really like, and I think a lot of these types of these models and applications Although maybe they are not, hey, once we hit this threshold, then this individual is ready for the next stage in rehab, or a lot of these kind of structured approaches. It provides such a common language for practitioners to speak, and I think that's such an important aspect of performance and of rehabilitation and of this entire field as a whole. Because when I say power, and if we think about two different things, well then we both may be right in a conversation or an argument that we may get into about power, but we're not speaking the same language. And so by creating these models and by creating these sorts of ideas, we can all come together and say, okay, this is how we're operationalizing these strength domains or these diagnostics. From here, now we can have a conversation. I think that's just such an important attribute or an aspect of performance as a whole. So I just want to say thank you so much for the work that you do and what you're doing to elevate the field, because I think it's an incredibly important area. So if anybody wants to reach back out to you or learn more about what you have going on, what's the best way to do so?
Sure. Probably best to reach out to me over LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on that, or you can send me an email. It's lachlan@forcelab.au.
Amazing. Lachlan, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Pleasure.